My name is Roger Tipping. I am the CEO of Infiltrade LLC. It's a technology company that focuses on software development for online retail, specifically retail and wholesale dropship automation. I've been doing that, well, I shouldn't say doing that. I've been doing technology stuff for about 13 years. It's when I started a business when I was in college with my college roommate at the time. There's been a significant evolution. What I'm doing now is really nothing like what we were doing in the early days of just web development, but I've done web development, animation, just basic web design, business efficiency consulting, and then now we're doing this for the last few years. So the topic today, imposter syndrome. Anyone heard the term before? Okay, quite a few of you. Anyone want to give like a 6-second definition? Like what's imposter syndrome? Nobody?
Trying to be someone you're not.
Who said that? Trying to be someone you're not? Okay.
Like it's kind of where you start something and you don't think you're up to par with what you should know in like a job or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
Claim to be an expert on something.
Okay. So before, I'm actually going to talk specifically about imposter syndrome around the halfway point of this. We're going to start with some other ideas first that I think segue into having a good understanding of what contributes to imposter syndrome. The syndrome itself is relatively simple to understand, but the underlying cause and effect is a little bit more complicated. So we'll start with a guy named MacArthur Wheeler. Anyone heard of MacArthur Wheeler? Nobody? Okay. MacArthur Wheeler, in April 19th, 1995, MacArthur Wheeler went on a miniature crime spree where he robbed 2 savings banks in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. MacArthur Wheeler was absolutely certain he would get away with this crime because he had devised a technique by which he could render his face completely invisible to security cameras. This method was based on the premise that if lemon juice worked as invisible ink on paper, it probably would work the same way on a human face. As most of you have hopefully guessed, that premise was flawed. The arresting officer quoted Mr. Wheeler as having said with utter disbelief, "But I wore the juice." Yeah, this truth is stranger than fiction event led to some inspiration for a study that was done that many of you may have heard of by a couple of researchers named David Dunning and Justin Kruger, what we now know as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Anyone familiar? Okay, great. I like that you can raise your hand now, Ziad. Ziad told me just heard about it 2 weeks ago, so he's feeling real good about himself. Dunning and Kruger, when they started this study, they devised a test where they would test participants and assess them on their sense of humor, their knowledge of grammar, and their ability to solve logic problems. And over the course of this study and a sequel study, they found a consistent trend amongst the different quartiles of participants. So the lowest quartile of participants consistently ranked themselves as being 62nd percentile in their self-assessment, even though their actual performance was an abysmal 12th percentile. This leads to the conclusion that someone with a complete lack of competence doesn't have the required knowledge to assess their own level of competence. So they're so incompetent that they think they're an expert. This is an effect that we see all the time, right? Now that's an aspect of Dunning-Kruger effect that if you've heard of it, heard people talking about it, you read about it, everybody knows that part. There's another aspect of the study that's more relevant to imposter syndrome, and it's something of a corollary to what people already know. What's also interesting throughout this series of tests is the highest quartile performers on the tests were also pretty bad at self-evaluating themselves. So in other words, they did really great on the tests, but when they were asked to evaluate how well they didn't do a good job of guessing what percentile they were. In fact, they guessed really similar to people in the lowest quartile. So the lowest quartile at 12% guessed that they were at 62nd percent, and the highest quartile that was at 88th percentile guessed themselves to be somewhere between 65 and 75th percentile. Pretty interesting. So that leads us to an interesting question. If it's a lack of competence that leaves someone unable to gauge their own measure of competence, why were the competent test takers unable to accurately self-evaluate? It's an interesting question, right? Okay, so let's do some crowd participation Anyone who is a business owner or has a skilled trade or like has some expertise in anything, raise your hand. Okay, great. That's a lot of you. Matt, I'll pick on you first because I already know you. I was already planning on doing this anyways. So I want your elevator pitch on like the last, let's say 15 years. Like what do you do right now? Let's start with that.
I'm currently an iOS software developer.
Okay.
I started off doing Flash application development, web development, similar to you.
Yep.
Worked for an agency for a while and then went out on my own. I've had some success with apps on the iOS App Store. I had an app featured last year by Apple at their WWDC keynote. I've worked with startups, I've worked with companies that are Fortune 500 level, I've worked with smaller outfits, doing things for like the life sciences and genetic space, retail.
This is getting too impressive. Your time is up. Okay. I'm gonna give you a redux of what you just said. Essentially, you started out like doing computer stuff with like Flash, which is like animation stuff or whatever. And then over like a few years, you like segued into some other things, and now you make like games and stuff. That's basically what you said,
Yeah.
right? Okay. Who else raised their hand? If you raise your hand, raise it again so I know who I'm working with. Okay.
I'm for the last 25 years worked in broadcasting in one form or another. Anything from master control to news producing to news directing, and currently I'm a commercial producer at NBC 24, and then I also produce a Christian music video show called Contact 2019.
Okay. So essentially, you're the kind of person that would like run a camera and like do some video editing on your computer, something like that. Okay, one more person. Raise your hands again. Well, there's way less people raising their hands than the first. Well, you see what I'm doing, so no one wants to do it anymore. Ziad.
I buy things. I've always, again, my job is to just buy things and buy them cheap. I've always been in purchasing, and then now with my own business, I just try to find cheap fruits and vegetables and turn them into juice.
Okay, this is an easy one, right? We all buy stuff. So you already do what we do. For some reason, somebody pays you to do it, right? Okay. So it's clear, like I'm being a jerk here, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm oversimplifying what it is that you are and what your skill set is in a way that to some extent, I'm reducing it to an absurd level, but I'm doing that to demonstrate something that often we do to ourselves. And an explanation for that, has anyone heard of CLT, constituent level theory? So constituent level theory describes this phenomenon by which the way that we think about a certain thing is heavily modified by distance between us and that thing. And those types of distances can be spatial, temporal, social, and hypothetical. So for the purpose of this conversation, we'll focus on temporal, so time, the time as a space of distance, and how it changes the way that we think about certain things and our perspective and perceptions of that thing. So a good example would be you're planning a vacation that's going to happen in 12 months. In constituent level theory, you're thinking about that in a high level. So I'm thinking about vacation that's 12 months from now. I'm thinking things like it's going to be warm and sunny. I'm going to be super relaxed. I'm going to have delicious food and drinks. I'm totally going to have a beach body like by the time that vacation comes around, right? That's high level thinking. Now, 2 weeks before you leave on that vacation, you move to a very low level type of thinking. And low level thinking is, I probably should bring some sunscreen. I should probably make some restaurant reservations. I need to find out if my hotel has free beach towels. And, oh yeah, 12 months in a row I forgot to go to the gym, so I need to start a 14-day juice cleanse. Okay, that's low-level thinking, very different from high-level thinking. What changed? You didn't change, but your proximity to the thing that you're thinking about changed temporally. It's closer to you. The reason why that's important is, if you've ever heard of something like, have you ever heard nostalgia bias? It's not a direct application to this, but it does describe that we have this way of modifying the way that we think of things based on this proximity. So the proximity of time in this case, instead of thinking about future temporal distance, consider past temporal distance. So in your case, this is a 15-year process, right? Or I said 15 years. I don't know if that's the actual timeline. Give or take. You said 25 years, right? That's a long time. So in this case, I would submit that one, if you did something over the course of 25 years, for me to ask you to describe it in 30 seconds, completely unrealistic, right? Completely unrealistic. 15 years, unrealistic. 5 years, unrealistic. And depending on what you did in the last 12 months of your life, still probably unrealistic. Really advanced skill sets can be developed in 12 months if someone puts the right amount of time into it. If someone puts a full-time effort into developing a new skill set, in 12 months, they can be an industry expert in certain things. Now, some things have a knowledge vertical that is absolutely higher than other fields, but in a lot of fields, 12 months of an 8 to 10 hour day investment is a significant skill set that you develop. So what I would submit and how construent level theory correlates to this topic is, when you think about the path that brought you from wherever you were at the start of this thing that you're working towards and the place that you are now, we have this really common tendency to oversimplify. And as a side note, this is also what we do when, and this kind of explains why the high quartile performers on these assessment tests in the Dunning-Kruger study, why they were not good at assessing themselves. When you're really good at something, there's a certain level of competence that you reach where along the path of learning within this knowledge vertical, you have both internalized and made intuitive really difficult things, difficult ideas, concepts, skills. And by the time you get them to the other side where you're very competent, very knowledgeable, and you have a high level of skill, those things become pretty easy. And this is due to capabilities like thin slicing and just there's a lot of cognitive function that take difficult things, process them subconsciously, and make us capable of making quick snap decisions that we wouldn't be able to make in anywhere remotely like that amount of time. So take, for example, someone who's an MLB batter, a guy who gets a ball thrown at 110 miles an hour, right? Most of us who aren't great baseball players, which I'm not, if you put me on at the plate and had someone throw a ball at me at 110 miles an hour, and I didn't know exactly where that ball was going to be and exactly how fast that ball was going to be thrown, my chances of hitting that ball at all, let alone hitting it well, I don't know what the actual odds are. I'm sure it's very, very, very low. I wouldn't guess that I would be able to hit more than 1 out of 60, 100, like whatever would be the random chance, I would assign that random chance as my likelihood of hitting the ball, right? So the fact that someone can get up there and you can be like, oh, they only hit 2 out of 10, that guy's terrible, right? That's actually really impressive, and the way that he's able to do it is all of these subconscious skills that he's developed over time allows him to watch a pitcher and make all kinds of conclusions about where that ball is going to be that is way more than just watching the ball with his eyes. If you're only watching the ball with your eyes as a human being and the limitations that we have, you're never going to hit the ball. You have to be able to make other assumptions about where that ball might be going based on the way that the pitcher winds up, the things you already know about that pitcher and his tendencies, et cetera, et cetera. None of this was part of my talk, so I hope it ties in somehow. Anyways, the point is this. When we look at the things that have become easy to us and intuitive, we tend to have this way of thinking about it that's like, oh, that's probably pretty easy for everybody else too. Because you forget how hard it was to get to the point that you are. You forget how difficult that thing used to be. And now you're at your point where it's like, well, if I can do this, then I might be a little bit above average. Because by the way, that's the other interesting thing. Across the board, everybody rates themselves as above average. It's an almost universal truth of self-evaluation. Everybody thinks that they're above average in almost everything. Now, the lowest level performers don't rate themselves as being very high above average, but they still think they're above average. The absolute highest performers rate themselves as above average, but not significantly above average. So there's kind of a regression of the mean towards like 65th to 70th percentile that kind of everyone rates themselves within that, roughly that span of percentile in performance. So what's really important for us when we're examining, and so now we'll get into how this all applies to imposter syndrome. And let me look up the definition here so I can say this in a way that's correct and succinct. Imposter syndrome is a psychological phenomenon in which people are unable to see their own accomplishments, dismissing them as luck, timing, or as a result of deceiving others into thinking they're more intelligent and competent than they really are. So some things that you might hear someone say that's suffering from imposter syndrome. If everyone knew my actual limitations, I would be exposed as a fraud. If I don't achieve more, people are going to find out that I really don't know what I'm doing at all. If I didn't have a likable personality, there's no chance I'd be in the position I have right now. So the following are some common experiences and results related to imposter syndrome: perfectionism, overworking, undermining your own achievements, fear of failure, discounting praise. Any of those things sound like maybe something that has happened to you before? Any of them? All of them? Probably all of them, right? So there's this interesting thing, like people who experience imposter syndrome, which, by the way, imposter syndrome, the name, and one of the original researchers back in, I think, 1979, who came up with the term imposter syndrome, regrets the fact that they called it a syndrome, because that seems to imply that it's some kind of specific form of like an illness or a mental condition, or that it's like a personality disorder. And the reality is it's not. So imposter syndrome, I believe her suggestion was that instead of calling it imposter syndrome, we should call it imposter experience, because in reality, it's more a sequence of events that lead to us having imposter experience. It's totally understandable and it's totally rational that if you're the kind of person who is successful or an overachiever of any sort, you're going to experience perfectionism, overworking, undermining your own achievements, fear of failure, discounting praise. Right? Makes sense. So at the end of the day, imposter syndrome is not a personality trait or a mental illness. It's a common experience that occurs in competent individuals and has a rational explanation. So, what can we do about it? It's a big question, right? This part of the talk, I don't have like great answers for you, so what can we do about it? That's a question. Feel free to the person who has an actual background in psychology.
I have an exercise called Trace of the Grades.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm feeling imposter syndrome, because I definitely have, I will look up what I admire about someone who I think is great, and then I'll identify where I have it in my own life, and then I
Nice.
feel it anymore.
That's great. Very cool. Anybody else? You can just throw something out there. Like, you don't have to be you don't have to have actual psychology. I don't have it. I mean, you heard my bio. Like, I do music stuff. Okay, so one thing that's really important, I think, when you're talking about anything that's related to cognitive biases, or just any low-level disruption in how we think in terms of metacognitive ability, the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we perceive our own realities, cognitive bias mitigation and de-biasing. There's a lot of research that's been done on those topics, and one thing is resoundingly clear by the research that has been done. Just being aware of these phenomenon is not enough to offset their negative effects. So just because you know about imposter syndrome doesn't mean you're not going to feel like an imposter. Just because you know about the Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't mean you're going to be good at self-evaluating yourself and your skill set and your own capabilities. So what do we need? We need some kind of concrete methods, and we need to be very intentional about what we do. So if you get on the internet and you search, how do you overcome imposter syndrome? How do you overcome and fill in the blank with any cognitive bias? You'll find any number of people telling you ways to do it. And from what I read, a lot of them seem to be really valid. So I'm not proposing there's any one way in particular. However, I would propose, for the sake of the fact that we have all these people in one room, where we have Code City, this thing that's been going on for, what's it been, like 7-8 months now, Nate? This better part of this year. You have all these people available. We got code boot camps going on now, like all this stuff. People that are legitimately excellent at what they do, legitimate experts in their field. They come here, and you have an opportunity to talk with them. I mean, after this is done, we hang out and talk, and you can get mentors and discuss whatever you want. So let me propose one potential solution to imposter syndrome. First, be more of a low-level thinker in the way that you evaluate yourself and your accomplishments. Don't oversimplify, be specific, focus on details. Second, seek outside evaluation from people that you trust and make them part of a positive feedback loop. You can do that here. You can find people here that can be a part of your feedback loop, people that you trust, people that know more than you do, people that you respect as being an expert. Now, how do you define an expert? And I suppose you could make an argument like, well, if I'm incompetent, then how could I recognize if someone else is competent, right? Like, oh, that's probably true. But having conversations like this and even considering, like asking yourself a question. I was just talking with Ziad about humility and how important humility is in self-evaluation. Humility is extremely important. Ask yourself a question like, am I that guy? I remember, anyone heard of Mike Birbiglia, the comedian? Mike Birbiglia. He's not super well known, but I think he was on Comedy Central a couple years ago. Anyways, he said before he gets on stage, he always asks himself this question. He's like, I don't know. I don't want to be the guy that doesn't know if I'm really good at something or really bad and just have no clue and just think I'm great. Like, I don't know if I'm the Miles Davis of comedy. Like, I'm on stage and some people are laughing and I'm feeling like I'm the Miles Davis of comedy. I'm like, it's like in reality, I'm the Kenny G of comedy. And it's like, no, right? So kind of a similar thing. Like, self-evaluate and asking yourself these questions, having the humility to consider, just because I have a pretty good job and somebody's willing to pay me money to do something, that in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean that I'm an expert. Just because some people have told me that I'm an expert doesn't necessarily mean I'm an expert. But then on the other hand, when you have this overwhelming burden of evidence of like all of these things adding up that seem to indicate that you're pretty good at something, one, you should probably accept that. And two, apply some of those same metrics to the people that you choose to be part of your positive feedback loop. Like people that are not just successful. Just because someone has made a lot of money doing something doesn't mean they're going to be a good mentor for you. But someone who's both successful and honest, someone that doesn't have this inflated view of themselves, especially people, and this is on the topic of humility, something that all of us can struggle with is, if we are good at something and we know something in a particular vertical, humans have this tendency to be like, well, I'm really good at this, so I'm also going to talk about this. The two have no connection to each other. Just because you're good at that doesn't mean you're good at this. And to some extent, it's an element of arrogance that we have a tendency to fall into. Anyways, I'm sort of rambling at this point, so questions and answers.
Have they done any studies on how imposter syndrome relates to people who maybe have other like personality disorders or other mental things going on?
I don't know specifically. I do know that, so first of all, imposter syndrome in the original study was actually in the 70s. So it precedes Dunning-Kruger effect and a lot of the other modern cognitive biases people are aware of. So it's been around, like the awareness has been around a long time. I would say they already acknowledge in the origin study that certain personalities have a higher tendency to experience imposter syndrome than others. So like some people tend to be a little more naturally confident, and that doesn't mean that they're an expert, but just because someone's naturally confident doesn't also mean that they're incompetent. Someone could be both very competent and very confident. There is, to some level, that type of person. On the other hand, someone could be very competent and always doubt themselves. That person is inevitably going to be experiencing imposter syndrome consistently. Now, as to like which specific personality types, I don't know. And I would encourage all of you, like anything that I've talked about today, I'm really barely scratching the surface of all the information and studies that are available. So if you find it interesting, go and research that topic specifically.
Where do you think, so first off, do you think in your own personal life
Yep.
you had at least some degree of success of eliminating imposter syndrome? And if you have, where do you think that's helped you?
Yeah. Okay. So imposter syndrome, if it's active, like in your life, like anything else that's similar to it, it can really dominate your life. Imposter syndrome writ large will cause you to not do anything that has any level of risk. You will probably cease eventually, if it's bad enough, you won't take any risks. Like you just want to like stay in one spot. You're not going to do anything that could potentially expose you to the people whose opinions you care about. So in my own life, I would say like doing a talk like this, I don't do talks like this. This is the second one that I've ever done. So to some extent, I would say this is what I would call a micro stressor for me to do this, because it represents an opportunity for me. Like if I come here and I bomb, like that would suck, but it's not that big of a deal, right? Like half of you are my friends, and you'd be like, we would make jokes about it later, and you'd be like, that really sucked. And I'm like, I know, and then I would cry later at home. But anyways, so like micro stressors are a great tool for people who experience imposter syndrome to help have other people that you trust evaluate you and help validate your own capabilities in situations that are safe. This is a safe space. If you want to be a speaker, take stuff like this. Like if you're a programmer who wants to be an educator, any brown bag lunch that someone offers you to speak at, take it. Like see if your ideas are good, see if your presentation is good. Use those safe opportunities as a means of quelling some of that doubt in your own mind.
Have you found anything that the rollout of like social media and the access to more opinions has kind of actually made this worse, right? So it was originally something that was in the 70s, and I don't know if in your research
Yeah.
you found like now we have more reason to be, we put it out there and there's lots of, put something out there, hey, this is the way to do it, and there's obviously conflicting opinions.
Sure.
You start to actually second guess more because you don't have that trusted circle that you were kind of mentioning.
Sure. Yeah. So just like the answer to her question, I would say not specifically, but I would say that coincides with research on the notion that on social media, the slice of a person's life, the way that a person is presented on social media, does not actually match that person's life. Like across the board, the way a person is portrayed on social media, you're going to perceive that as very different from how you perceive that person if you were in a room with them every waking hour of their life. It's totally different. So if you are under the false assumption that everybody is what they are on social media, then absolutely it's going to lead to some, not just imposter syndrome, but all kinds of other, you're not going to measure up to the best version of everyone, right? And you know that you're not the best version of yourself because you don't, I hope you don't just get updates on yourself on social media. That would be really weird. I love that you waited for me to point at you. I looked at you and I was like, yeah, and you're just like, I'm not going to say anything until you point at me. I was staring at Nate's belly button. That's what it was.
How do you?
I wouldn't know.
Okay. I guess it's kind of like a yes or no question, but then I want your feedback.
Sure.
How do you think spreading of the knowledge of imposter syndrome and the Dunning-Kruger effect, just people becoming more aware of that, can kind of make the world, like a little freer and more prosperous?
Yeah, so from a broader standpoint, I would say, and I've used the term metacognitive analysis a couple times. Like metacognitive really just refers to like kind of trying to step outside of, like you're in your head all the time, right? The perspective that you take is this first person perspective, trying to apply more of an external perspective to the way that you think. So in other words, I already know I'm thinking a certain way. Now let me try to pretend, and I think in psychology they call this psychological distance, where like you can pretend like I'm a third party in this situation and I'm going to examine as that third party, even like making up an idea of this, like who is this person and what is their backstory. I'm going to examine my own thought processes, attempting to do it through the lens of what maybe a third party would examine it from. And that leads us to some really powerful capabilities. Like being able to self-examine is crucial because a lot of the ways that we think, the way that the brain functions, there's certain imperatives that the mind has to oversimplify, to make decisions that, to make a fully detailed and rational decision would take a lot of time. So we have all these, the brain has all these shortcuts. A lot of those shortcuts are actually cognitive biases. The cognitive biases provide us with shortcuts. The problem is, in many cases, they're totally inaccurate because of the fallacies that are built into these cognitive biases. So I know, actually, Matt, you posted something a couple weeks ago on like all of the cognitive biases, and there was an article that had something to do with that, like helping people recognize it. Even if you're someone who is, let's say, hyper aware of cognitive biases, that doesn't mean that your brain is gonna be like, oh great, you taught me not to have cognitive biases, so I won't have them anymore. That's not what happens. You have to have this secondary filter that your thinking goes through, where like, this is my impulse, this is any of the potential biases it could be, and really try to meta-analyze that. And I think the world would be a much better place if people were more rational and less driven by common biases. Hope that answers your question. Anybody else? Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. You've been a fantastic audience.